Before we begin this journey, remember that every image used here is symbolic, artistic metaphors meant to open the mind, not replace professional psychological guidance or any form of therapy. And what may be worth paying attention to is not necessarily when you lose interest in the world around you, but when you begin to lose interest in yourself. Imagine waking up one day and realizing the things that once made you feel alive no longer reach you the way they used to. Activities that once excited you now feel strangely distant. Conversations around you start sounding like repetitive loops with no meaning. And deeper than that, you begin to notice the goals you've chased for years suddenly feel empty. At first, that experience can feel deeply unsettling. You may wonder, what's wrong with me? Am I becoming lazy? Depressed? Am I somehow drifting away from life itself? But what if this loss of interest isn't a temporary collapse at all, but a message, a signal that something much deeper is beginning to move within you? Today, we're stepping into an idea that is both powerful and often misunderstood, one rooted in depth psychology. It touches the core of psychological growth, existential meaning, and the journey of inner awakening. And from there, we'll explore why losing interest in everything may actually be one of the deepest and most important signs of an inner transformation you've been living through. And stay with me until the very end of this journey, because the realization waiting there is not only important, it can be profoundly transformative. It has the power to change how you understand life, the struggles you're facing, and even the purpose of your own existence. But before we go deeper, let me share something personal, my own story and experience. I believe many people here may be struggling in a similar way, full of desire, full of ambition, yet unable to begin, or always giving up halfway without really understanding why. That's exactly why I made the video The Lazy Yet Ambitious Person last week, because that was me. I had ambition, but the moment something felt difficult, I would avoid it. I never really liked what people call discipline, and yet when I looked at people considered successful, they all seemed to share similar habits: going to bed early, waking up early, meditating, reading, constantly learning and studying. I tried those things too, but only for a while. Then I'd quit. I could never sustain anything long-term. And slowly, without realizing it, I installed a belief in my own mind. I'm just not someone who likes discipline. I'm not built for that kind of life. It wasn't until a long meditation retreat that I touched the root of that belief. And suddenly, I saw a clear image of my younger cousin, just 1 year younger than me. I had watched someone grow up under extremely rigid rules imposed by family. From how they picked up food, to how they held a bowl of rice, to what time they studied, what time they ate, everything was predetermined. And later in life, the family kept choosing for them, the school, the major, even the path they were expected to walk. It was a family that provided everything materially, cared deeply on the surface, yet what I always heard beneath it was exhaustion, suffering, and the pain of being controlled. And then I realized my unconscious had quietly stored that image. Somewhere deep inside, I had developed a fear that if I became disciplined, I too would become trapped, forced, depleted, living a life of obligation, doing things I didn't love, only to still never reach what I truly wanted. And strangely enough, recognizing that was the first step in healing. To know that I was afraid, and to understand where that fear came from. From there, I stopped judging myself. I stopped blaming myself for procrastination and inner conflict. I began writing all of it down. I practiced Ho'oponopono as a way of releasing old emotional layers consistently for 2 weeks. And I genuinely felt a deep, unmistakable lightness begin to emerge. Alongside that, I stopped making grand plans. I started setting small goals, very small goals, so small they no longer felt intimidating. And I simply began, one step at a time. I started acknowledging myself, appreciating myself. Every night before sleep, I'd wrap my arms around myself and speak words of love inward. And then I realized something important. Much of my ambition in the past wasn't truly serving me. It was serving the gaze of society, the expectations of loved ones, and even the pressure I had placed on myself. I returned to the things I had once genuinely loved. I loved reading, so instead of obsessively chasing old illusions, I kept going to work. But each day, I gave myself 10 minutes to read. Then that time naturally grew, and before long, I found myself wanting to sleep earlier so I could wake up early, clear-minded, and read more deeply. Books expanded my awareness. They helped loosen beliefs I had carried for years. I've always loved nature, so after 8 hours of work, I chose to go outside. At first, it was just breathing, then walking, and eventually, I began to run. But I didn't run like an athlete chasing performance. I ran slowly, to regulate my breath, to reconnect with my body and with myself. I didn't run to lose weight, or hit a target, or force discipline onto myself. I ran to enjoy nature, to watch the sky, to feel life unfolding around me. And that's when I realized I didn't need discipline to read, and I didn't need discipline to move my body. When I truly enjoy what I'm doing, things begin to unfold naturally. I started redefining success, redefining happiness. At that time, my therapist, in many ways, was my meditation teacher. He gave me a kind of inner stillness that helped me understand myself more deeply. Then came books. Then the small things I loved. Words of self-recognition, nature, moments of softness, learning to love myself a little more. That became my way of rebuilding my relationship with myself, listening inward through meditation, walking, changing perception, and taking steady action. And I've come to see this. If you're not someone wired for iron-willed discipline, then find a method that belongs to you. Because the conscious mind may understand the need for discipline, but the unconscious only runs on habit. It doesn't care whether something brings you growth or value. It only cares about one thing. Does this feel safe? That's why you make the step so small you can complete it. And if it still feels hard, make it even smaller. Act and enjoy the act. Enjoy it deeply enough that your psyche begins to register it as something safe. Once your inner mind learns that something is safe, fear begins to shrink. Things begin to flow more easily. Even now, that's how I make every video. I enjoy the process itself. And when I sit down and read your comments, I enjoy the praise and even the criticism. I've even learned to observe the flashes of defensiveness that arise when someone says something harsh. Then I return inward and remind myself, everyone sees through the lens of their own awareness. And I feel gratitude simply because they were here, because they took time to share. That's how I try to live now. Not disciplined in the old sense, but present, intentional, and loving toward myself. If these reflections resonate with you, take a moment to subscribe, like, and share this with someone who may be moving through the same inner confusion. And leave a few words about what you've been feeling lately. Because what we're about to explore together may change how you understand emotion and perhaps your entire inner world. Depth psychology suggests that the inner world is not a static structure, but a living system, always moving, always seeking balance. The unconscious does not tolerate stagnation when we remain trapped in outdated roles, values, or identities. And when that happens, the psyche does not stay silent. It quietly withdraws energy from the outer world. Jung called this psychic energy libido. In classical psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud saw libido primarily as sexual energy, a fundamental drive shaping behavior, emotion, and personality. For Freud, much of inner conflict arose from desires repressed into the unconscious. Anxiety, obsession, even neurosis could be understood as expressions of that repressed psychic force. But in the thought of Carl Jung, libido was expanded in a radically different direction. For Jung, libido was not merely sexual energy, it was life energy itself. It fuels the whole of psychic life. It appears as the will to live, the drive to create, the hunger for meaning, the urge toward self-development, the impulses that move us into the world, or back inward. If Freud saw libido mainly as biological force, Jung saw it as psychological energy, something that can shift, transform, and guide a person toward wholeness. And when that energy withdraws, the world can begin to feel faded, flat, stripped of meaning. Which is why losing interest in everything may not simply be boredom, but a sign that your conscious life is no longer aligned with deeper demands emerging from the unconscious. The goals you're pursuing may no longer reflect who you are becoming. The ambitions that once burned brightly may belong to an older version of you. And when that misalignment appears, the psyche doesn't call for change through logic. It speaks through feeling, through boredom, numbness, inner paralysis. That may be the language the unconscious uses to be heard. And what's striking is that modern society teaches us to fear those states. It convinces us that only constant forward motion, constant productivity, constant striving is normal. But sometimes the very pause itself is the sign that a profound transformation has begun. We're taught losing passion is a malfunction that must be fixed immediately. But Jung did not see it as pathology. He saw it as a turning point. Many people entering this phase may actually be standing at the threshold of individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming fully and authentically oneself. Have you ever noticed how outward success does not always bring inward fulfillment? How achievement can sometimes leave behind a strange emptiness that's hard to name? Jung understood this paradox through the idea of the persona, the social mask we wear in order to function in the world. And when a person becomes overly identified with that mask, they gradually lose contact with the deeper self until they are living only through expectations, roles, and social approval. And when the authentic self is forgotten, the unconscious eventually speaks by draining meaning from the pursuits directed outward. That's why this loss of interest often comes with a sense of disorientation. The structures that once supported and shaped your life begin to tremble and slowly collapse, leaving you feeling lost, confused, even afraid of the emptiness where desire and motivation used to be. And yet, this inner emptiness is not accidental. It carries a deeper purpose. It creates the necessary silence for reflection. It opens space to face the inner world. And it prepares the ground for values that are no longer borrowed from society, but discovered through lived insight. Something thinkers across history have pointed toward. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of the collapse of old values as a necessary stage before new values can be born. Viktor Frankl observed that a crisis of meaning often comes before a deeper understanding of purpose. And even in ancient spiritual traditions, periods of inner dryness have been described as necessary precursors to awakening. What connects all these perspectives is a shared recognition. Suffering, discomfort, and the friction of life, when faced consciously, can become the force that initiates transformation. Ask yourself honestly, what have you lost interest in lately? Your work, your relationships, the ambitions that once drove you, or the distractions that once defined your life? And more importantly, what might that loss be revealing about your inner development? Could it be that your unconscious is urging you to stop living automatically and begin living consciously? If you can sense that, don't rush to escape this state. Carl Jung warned that resisting this inner withdrawal often increases suffering. Because when you drown yourself in distraction, when you force enthusiasm into places where it no longer lives, you aren't healing. You're silencing the voice of the unconscious instead of listening to it. Real growth begins when a person allows themselves to stay with that emptiness, to feel it fully without rushing to fill it. We've only reached the beginning, and in the next part, we'll explore how this loss of interest manifests emotionally and psychologically, why it often arrives alongside anxiety or sadness, and how understanding this process can spare you unnecessary suffering. But for now, allow yourself to sit with this thought and observe your inner experience with awakened curiosity rather than judgment. And if this resonates with you, let me know. Because when your interest in the outer world begins to fade, that rarely happens in isolation. It often comes with a complex emotional state, subtle, difficult to grasp, and at times overwhelming. Anxiety may appear without a clear cause. Sadness may rise even when no specific event has happened. And the quiet, restless unease can coexist with a strange absence of desire to act. Jung saw these emotional states not as random disturbances, but as signals that the psyche is entering a process of self-reorganization. At a deeper level, Jung recognized that when psychic energy, the force driving inner life, withdraws from outer objects, it doesn't disappear, it turns inward. And that inward movement forces a person to face thoughts, memories, and emotions once forgotten, avoided, or repressed. And that is why losing interest in everything can feel so uncomfortable. Because when familiar distractions fall away, you are left alone with yourself. And for many people, that is exactly what they have avoided for years. In that space, old questions may begin to rise. Questions about who you really are when you are no longer defined by your work, your relationships, or your external achievements. And those questions may be the beginning of a very different kind of awakening. Is the life you're living truly aligned with your deepest inner values? Carl Jung believed questions like these arise when the unconscious is seeking integration, and the psyche is no longer satisfied with surface-level meaning, and begins demanding depth. In analytical psychology, this often corresponds to what Jung called confronting the shadow. The shadow represents the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, or never fully developed. As many of you shared with me after I published The Lazy Yet Ambitious Person, you began recognizing old wounds within you that had never truly healed. That is the shadow asking to be faced. And when attention toward the outer world begins to fade, the shadow has more room to reveal itself. It may appear as irritability, self-doubt, regret, or a sharper awareness of personal shortcomings. But this confrontation is not meant to punish you, nor is it an invitation to blame those who once hurt you. It is meant to lead you toward wholeness. Many people mistake this phase for depression, but Jung made an important distinction. When it arises from inner transformation, it often carries symbolic purpose. It slows the rhythm of your life. It forces reflection. It interrupts compulsive action. And in that sense, it can be understood as a necessary pause in the life of the psyche. A sacred stillness before transformation. Think about how nature works. Before a seed can sprout, it must be buried in darkness. Before a butterfly emerges, it must break through the cocoon. Jung often used symbols like these to explain inner development. And losing interest in everything is often the cocoon stage. From the outside, it may look like stagnation, but inside, something profound may be changing. The danger begins when this state is misunderstood or resisted. Because modern culture constantly glorifies endless productivity, relentless positivity, and forms of success measured from the outside. So when someone feels empty or unmotivated, they often feel pressured to fix it immediately, push through, stay busy at all costs. Jung warned that this very attitude can deepen suffering. Because when the psyche is asking for inward attention but is continually ignored, the symptoms do not disappear, they often intensify. Have you noticed how forcing yourself rarely brings true change? How pretending to care about what no longer matters can leave you even more exhausted? That happens because psychic energy cannot simply be commanded by willpower. It has to be understood, respected. And Jung believed the healthiest path in this phase is learning to listen to those quiet but deeply meaningful signals coming from the inner world. Even uncomfortable experiences serve an essential role here. The task is not to rush to recover lost enthusiasm. It is to dare to ask deeper, more honest questions. Ask yourself, what in your current life no longer feels true to who you are? What roles are you carrying only to fill an inner emptiness? And which of your desires were formed through pressure rather than authentic choice? Don't rush to answer. Stay with those questions. Let them haunt you in a good way. Because truths like these rarely reveal themselves all at once. They tend to unfold slowly, through reflection, through dreams, through honest observation of your inner life. And it wasn't only Jung who touched this. Existential thinkers also emphasized that meaning is not something handed to us or imposed from outside. It is something discovered only by facing the uncertainty of existence itself. Viktor Frankl also understood that when old structures of meaning collapse, a kind of emptiness almost inevitably appears. But that very emptiness can open the possibility of a deeper sense of purpose, one rooted in responsibility, emotional maturity, and the way we choose to show up in this life. And honestly, I've been through a season like that myself. To be honest with you, I used to be a very committed atheist. I only believed in what could be proven, really. Only in what I had personally experienced. I used to look at people who practiced vegetarianism, chanted, or prayed with deep skepticism, even a little contempt, if I'm honest. I would think, why believe in something so spiritual and abstract when ordinary life is already hard enough? My prejudice came from what I had seen around me. I watched my grandmother, a woman devoted to going to the temple, reciting prayers every day. Yet she still seemed full of anger, attachment, and resentment, even toward her own children. And back then, I concluded religion was just a kind of psychological coping mechanism. But in the months I moved through pain, through loss, through long nights of feeling utterly directionless, in that frightening silence, something in me kept crying out, sometimes aloud, asking, why is my life so painful? Am I going to live this way forever? Is there any way my life can change? And now, I believe, when I sincerely contemplate something from the heart, my unconscious begins working on its own. It begins looking for a path, one that protects life within me. And the first doorway I encountered was Buddhism, through a friend. But this time, I didn't approach Buddhism through rituals or ceremony. I approached it almost as a science of the mind. I joined meditation retreats, short and long, listened to teachings, learned meditation as a way to clear the mind and understand myself more deeply. Then tried applying those insights in everyday life. And over time, about a year, I began untangling many of the struggles around me. Not perfectly, of course, but something shifted. This phase can make you feel profoundly alone, almost separated from the people around you. People who seem content in patterns and routines that no longer satisfy you. But Carl Jung saw this as a natural part of individuation. Because when transformation happens from within, relationships and outer circumstances can fall out of rhythm with the person you are becoming. That doesn't mean you're becoming cold or distant. It may simply mean your inner compass is being recalibrated. Ask yourself honestly, are you afraid of the emptiness itself? Or afraid of what that emptiness may be revealing about you? What would happen if you stopped running from this feeling and started listening, started allowing it? The truth is, this inward turning does not last forever. It is a phase, but an important one. And if you move through it consciously, you step into a new cycle. If not, you may keep circling through the same emptiness in different forms. In the next part, we'll explore how to move through this phase consciously and how to avoid the traps that often appear along the way. Because there is a crucial moment in this inner journey when a quiet but profound choice appears. You can numb the discomfort and rush back into familiar patterns, or you can remain fully present and allow this process to unfold. Jung believed this choice determines whether loss of interest becomes merely a silent season of suffering or a doorway into deep inner growth. Because the psyche does not ask us to suffer blindly. It calls for conscious participation in the process of transformation. And here, Jung emphasized the importance of awareness, not forced positivity, not frantic productivity, but a lucid and attentive state of mind. As outer preoccupations begin to fade, the inner world often becomes more vivid. Dreams may grow stronger, more symbolic. Memories you thought were resolved may rise again. Emotional reactions may become intense or strangely hard to explain. And Jung saw all of this as direct communication from the unconscious in its effort to restore balance and meaning. And one of the most common traps in this phase is self-judgment. That quiet belief that something must be wrong with you because you feel lost, detached, or uncertain. But often, what feels like falling apart may be the beginning of coming together. Many people interpret their loss of interest as a personal failure. They compare themselves to others and conclude they are weak, broken, somehow falling behind. But Carl Jung warned that comparison during a phase like this can be especially damaging, because individuation is never a collective journey. It unfolds uniquely in each person according to an inner rhythm, not according to any social timetable. Another trap, more subtle but just as dangerous, is over-identifying with the emptiness itself. Even though this state may carry transformative meaning, Jung emphasized that it should never become your identity. Because you are not your apathy. You are not your emptiness. Those are temporary states, not permanent definitions of who you are. The task is to remain in living dialogue with those states, rather than surrendering to them completely or becoming fused with them. Jung often spoke about the central role of symbols during inner transitions, especially when purely rational explanations no longer have the power to guide us. Because symbols become a bridge between conscious understanding and the deeper truths of the unconscious. And that is why art, myth, and literature hold such a special place in this process. In seasons when you lose interest in life, contemplation can become especially powerful, because it allows what wants to be expressed to emerge, without forcing it into clarity too soon, while quietly shaping structures that are still in the process of being born. Throughout history, many great thinkers and creators moved through periods of apparent stagnation before breakthrough. Philosophers, artists, scientists, all have described seasons when nothing seemed meaningful anymore, when old frameworks had collapsed, and the new ones had not yet formed. Jung did not see this as coincidence, but as an inner law of psychological life. Genuine creation often requires a dissolution before something deeper can reorganize itself. Emotionally, this phase can feel unstable and unpredictable. Some days you may feel strangely peaceful, even relieved to set down outer pressures and expectations for a while. But other days, a vague anxiety may arise, as if you are drifting without an anchor. Jung encouraged patience with those fluctuations, because the psyche moves according to organic rhythms. It does not develop in a straight line, and any attempt to force stability too quickly can interfere with a maturation process that needs time. One of Jung's deepest insights was that meaning cannot be forced into existence, but it can be prepared for by creating enough inner space for it to emerge. When you allow uncertainty, you make room for new values to appear naturally, not as catchy ideals or socially approved ambitions, but as something that feels alive and true to you. And when that shift begins, interest returns, but not as obsession or compulsion. It returns as a quiet, steady commitment, something not dramatic, but deeply alive. So ask yourself this: if you removed all expectations, all praise, and even the fear of being judged, what would still matter to you? What activities, what ideas still touch something in you very softly, even if they haven't yet returned as excitement? Sometimes the beginning of renewal doesn't arrive as passion. Sometimes it arrives as a faint pull, a whisper, a subtle sense that something, however small, still feels real. And often, that is where a new life begins. Carl Jung believed these faint signals are often far more trustworthy than intense bursts of passion that flare up and fade quickly. Because what truly belongs to you rarely arrives like a fever. It comes more like a quiet but persistent calling. Psychologically, this marks a shift from a life shaped by the pressure to conform and meet external standards to a life guided by authenticity. A life that no longer asks, "What do others expect of me?" but begins asking, "What feels true for me?" In the first half of life, adapting to society is necessary. It helps us learn how to survive. But at a certain point, adaptation alone is no longer enough. The inner life begins asking for something more, a deeper process, what Jung called individuation. And often, losing interest in goals imposed from the outside is one of the earliest signs that this need has become urgent. Not because you are lost, but perhaps because something deeper in you is refusing to keep living by what no longer belongs to you. And with that, the way you relate to other people may begin to change. Superficial conversations may start to feel exhausting. Depth, genuine understanding, even silence itself may begin to feel more nourishing than stimulation ever did. Jung didn't see this as withdrawing from life. He saw it as refining the way a person relates to the world. The more deeply aligned you become with yourself, the more selective and conscious you become about where and on what you spend your life energy. Pause and really sit with this. What if the loss of interest you've been afraid of is actually the voice of the inner self, refusing a life too narrow for who you truly are? What if it is the most honest response your inner world can give to your current reality? Instead of asking, "When will my motivation come back?" maybe the deeper question is, "What kind of life is truly worthy of my energy?" Because this may be the final and most powerful realization of all. Losing interest is not a sign life has run out of meaning, but evidence that borrowed, distorted meanings are beginning to fall away. And then, after a long stretch of emptiness, confusion, or emotional stillness, a subtle shift begins. A new kind of interest quietly returns. Not the restless excitement of the past, but something calmer, deeper, more stable. At this point, you may no longer crave recognition or outward achievement in the same way. Instead, you begin moving towards something with depth, something enduring. And Jung believed this marks a decisive turning point in psychological development. Because this is when meaning is no longer borrowed from the outside world, but begins arising from your own inner center. And when interest returns, it carries a different quality, because you have changed. Psychic energy is no longer poured into roles, expectations, or goals disconnected from inner truth. It begins moving toward what feels essential, even if it looks modest, simple, or utterly unglamorous. Jung emphasized that genuine meaning rarely announces itself loudly. It usually begins as a quiet sense of rightness, a deep alignment between your actions and the person you are becoming. And many people are surprised at this stage to realize what truly matters to them has changed. Status starts losing its pull. Praise no longer holds the center, and in its place grows a gravitation toward simplicity, depth, and service, rather than constant stimulation. Sometimes, what looks like losing interest in life is really life asking you to love what matters more deeply. Carl Jung did not see this as a decline in ambition, but as a refinement of your value system. When the ego no longer dominates your inner life and instead enters into a living dialogue with a deeper center of the self, where new meaning and direction begin to form. And at this point, a new realization emerges. Losing interest in everything is never the end of your vitality. It is a withdrawal of energy from what no longer deserves it. Your inner world is carrying out a quiet act of protection, preventing you from sinking deeper into a life that is misaligned with who you truly are. The emptiness you feel is not decay, it is purification. And what you perceive as stagnation may actually be preparation for transformation. Jung described individuation as the courage to live your own life, rather than playing a role in a script written by society or others. That kind of courage doesn't need to be loud or aggressive. It shows up quietly steady, grounded, deeply rooted in your psyche. And when interest begins to return after this inward phase, it carries a completely different quality. You no longer have to chase meaning. You begin to recognize that it is already present within your life. This is where ideas from different philosophical and psychological traditions begin to converge. Viktor Frankl observed that meaning truly emerges when a person commits to something beyond self-centered gratification. And thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche explored how individuals must create new values after the old ones collapse. Jung brought these insights into a psychological framework, showing that this process unfolds most naturally when we learn to respect, rather than suppress, the unconscious. Even so, uncertainty may still be part of the journey. Individuation does not eliminate doubt entirely. But that doubt no longer paralyzes you. It simply becomes part of the flow of life. You begin to trust the signals coming from within, rather than being swept away by the noise of the outside world. You can start to feel clearly what drains your energy and what nourishes your soul, even when it comes with challenges. Your relationships may shift again at this stage, but from a very different place than before. You no longer seek connection out of fear or emptiness. You begin choosing connection based on depth and authenticity. You may speak less, but your words carry truth. You may do less, but every action becomes more present. This is how the psyche clears space, removing what no longer serves so that something real can take root. And when you understand this, fear begins to give way to respect. Resistance transforms into curiosity, and confusion softens into a quiet confidence. So if right now you feel isolated, uninspired, or empty, don't rush to escape it. Try listening to it. Reflect with it. Be fully present with each moment as it unfolds. Because this may not be a phase of being lost at all. It may be life asking you to stop living unconsciously and start living truthfully. And when interest returns, as it naturally will, you'll realize it doesn't come back as intense excitement or noisy stimulation. It returns as depth, not as fleeting enthusiasm, but as the presence of real meaning. This is not the end of a journey. It is the beginning of becoming who you truly are. As that understanding begins to deepen, a very subtle but profoundly important shift starts to happen in the way you relate to your inner life. You stop seeing emotions as inconveniences to eliminate and begin seeing them as messages to be understood. Carl Jung believed the psyche is always communicating with us, even in moments when it seems most silent. And perhaps many things you once called a crisis were simply the deeper part of you trying to speak. Apathy, boredom, and loss of interest are not meaningless states. They are symbolic states, carrying profound messages about your existence. And precisely because they interrupt the familiar flow of life, you may one day look back and realize that every major turning point in your life began with a season of deep inner uncertainty. Those were the moments when certainty dissolved and the future became a fog. Jung would say this is no accident. Psychological growth does not move forward only by accumulating something new. It also unfolds through the shedding of what has become outdated. What no longer aligns with your authentic self must, at some point, fall away. That's why people who move through this phase often develop a completely different relationship with time. They live less hurriedly, react less impulsively to upheaval, feel less desperate to prove themselves to the world. And when interest returns, it is no longer scattered across endless distractions. It becomes focused, intentional. Jung believed this gathering of psychic energy is one of the clearest signs that a person is living closer to their inner center. And you may notice another profound shift. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin asking, "What is this trying to show me?" That change in perspective is not naive optimism. It is a kind of psychological realism, one that acknowledges pain without reducing it to meaninglessness. Jung often emphasized that meaning does not erase suffering, but it can make suffering bearable. At this stage, many people begin to feel a quiet responsibility toward their own life. Not as an imposed duty, but as something arising from deep self-awareness. You realize ignoring inner truth carries consequences, and that conforming to the crowd when it costs you authenticity leads only to profound emptiness. And this illuminates Jung's deeper warning. The greatest danger is not losing interest in the world around you, but losing interest in yourself. But what we've been exploring points to almost the opposite. This may be the unconscious reclaiming your attention-drawing scattered energy back to its source. And what waits ahead is not a return to your old life, but the emergence of a more conscious one. So when you hear the phrase, "You may begin losing interest in everything," don't hear it as a prophecy of decline or failure. Hear it as a description of a threshold, a meeting point between who you have been and who you are becoming, a space between borrowed meanings and self-discovered purpose, between noise and depth. And if you find yourself standing at that threshold, remember this: you are not late. You are not failing at life. You may simply be listening to a signal many people ignore for decades. And the very act of listening may already be placing you on a completely different path. Jung once wrote that the greatest privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And sometimes, the first step toward that privilege is losing interest in everything that does not belong to your essence. Thank you for walking with me today into these hidden corners of the psyche. because I believe emptiness and disorientation are not abysses of decline, but necessary spiritual silences through which the authentic self begins to speak. Don't be afraid of the dark places or the silence within you. Sometimes those are precisely the places where the purest truths are kept, truths the noisy outer world could never touch. The journey of becoming yourself was never meant to be smooth. It asks you to have the courage to shed old masks and answer the call from within. And if you feel lost, remember, this may be the moment your soul is undertaking its greatest journey of all, the journey back to yourself. Keep listening, keep reflecting, and don't be afraid to walk your own path, even when it looks different from the crowd. And above all, may you find peace and strength in the truth of who you are.